To what I hope is going to become a pretty lengthy series on the letter to the Galatians. So I want to, in this video anyway, give you some idea of what you can expect here. The first thing is a disclaimer. I do not come to this series of videos with the expectation or the intention that it will be an evangelistic tool. It is not my purpose in making these videos to try to convert anyone. My hope is that there will be some people who are unbelievers who will be interested enough to watch this, as well as some Christians already who will be interested enough to watch this. And this is a safe zone if you are a non-believer. Having said that, though, I should warn you that I'm a very opinionated person, and I will make no bones about expressing my opinions very strongly, very forcefully. If you are uncomfortable encountering opinions that you don't agree with, then you should just go elsewhere. I'm eccentric enough in the way that I think that I will be likely to offend everybody at some point or another, and if you're just not interested in that, I'm sure you can find a website that will tell you that Galatians means what you think Galatians ought to mean. There's plenty of websites out there. The only real reason for listening to my videos, besides my magnetic and charming personality, is if you want to study in some detail this letter to the Galatians, if you find it enlightening or inspiring or encouraging or challenging. Those are the goals that I have for myself and for you. If you've got any comments and you can express them in a reasonably polite and respectful tone, then please leave your comments here and I will see what I can do about responding. So, I am intending to go through the letter to the Galatians in a verse-by-verse manner, paying attention to detail. Some people would say that the devil is in the details, and I think when it comes to the Bible, it's the Spirit that's in the details, and I don't want to miss that. So this is going to be pretty lengthy if my endurance doesn't give out, and if your endurance doesn't give out. Not only verse by verse, but sometimes phrase by phrase. Sometimes later on in Galatians, word by word. But this is not done with the purpose of splitting it up, of separating verses, of a sort of divide and conquer approach to the Bible. I am a strong opponent of the proof text method of theology. I think that does great harm to people's understanding of the Scripture. I think it leads to really bad theology. Now, I'm like everybody else. I have my favorite verses that I snip out of the Bible, and I memorize them, and I think about them, and they're greatly encouraging, and they mean a great deal to me personally. But that's a bad way to do theology, doctrine, thinking about the core of your beliefs. What we need to do is tie the passages, the verses of Scripture together. You should think of a verse in Scripture as being like a puzzle piece in a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah, individual pieces can have a beautiful shape. And they all have pretty colors on them, and as aesthetic experience, they can be very excellent. But they get their real meaning when you fit them together, and a larger picture begins to emerge, and that's my intent. I want to see how the meaning of each verse grows out of the meaning of the verses that came before it, and how it leads into the meaning of the verses that come after it, and how they all fit together. And by the end of our study of the letter of Galatians, I want us to have some sense that we see a big picture from this, that we have some depth of understanding. So that's my purpose. That's what I'm hoping to get to. And so here I am, starting with chapter 1, verse 1. And of course, verse 1 has no preceding verses to have its meaning grow out of. And that means that we have to look ahead. The meaning of verse 1 is only tied to what comes afterwards. So we need to get some background on the letter to the Galatians. Now, the letter to the Galatians was written in the midst of doctrinal controversy. It's written in the heat of the moment. It's written rather passionately, and it was probably written in a hurry, perhaps just at one sitting. I can imagine Paul sitting down and, in a sense of urgency, just writing this letter and mailing it off. The doctrinal controversy that was at issue in this letter is basically what to do with Gentiles. The original Christian church was an exclusively Jewish movement. And as time went on, Gentiles began to trickle in, and then the numbers of them grew, and it was largely Paul's fault. Not entirely, but he certainly had a lot to do with it. And the trickling in of Gentiles became something more like an avalanche. And so the question was, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles? How do they fit in? What is the connection between all these Gentiles and the traditions of Israel? Especially, what is the connection between all these Gentiles and the law of Moses, which really defined Israel as a people? And you have all these Gentiles coming in, some of whom have never really read the law of Moses, and who are coming from a very different spiritual and moral background than the Jews came from. So it was of some importance. It wasn't long before the number of Gentiles in the Christian movement outnumbered the Jewish believers. And things were getting a little scary. And that's the doctrinal issue. Paul had been to Galatia. On his first missionary journey, he had converted a large number of mainly Gentile people, and had gone through, and had a successful trip, planted several different churches, and returned to his home base of operations. And at some months later, we don't know exactly how long, but he hears a rumor that other missionaries have gone to Galatia from Jerusalem and were telling the people there that his teaching, the gospel that he preached, was to some extent in error. And so Paul is horrified. He's, he has this picture of all of his work in Galatia sort of falling apart. So he writes this letter to try to cope with these teachers who are influencing the Galatians against him. Now, inevitably, I mean, they're arguing theologically, they're arguing logically, they're trying to give biblical reasons to the Galatians for why Paul is wrong, and this is a dangerous situation because the Galatians really are not familiar, the Gentile ones anyway, are not very familiar with the Old Testament, with the biblical material that these Paul's opponents are going to be using against him. And so it would be easy to mislead them, it would be easy to deceive them. But there was also an inevitable personal component to their opposition. You try to discredit a person's teaching, it's good strategy, actually, to try to discredit their authority. Paul was teaching them as an apostle. And these opponents of Paul that came to the Galatians, they were not apostles. And so the question would immediately arise, how dare you oppose the teaching of an apostle? And the only way that they can answer a question like that is by undermining, to some extent, Paul's claim to be an apostle. Now, how could they do that? I mean, if you're an apostle, you're an apostle, right? Well, the apostolic structure of the church, the early church was really ruled by this council of 12 apostles that met in Jerusalem. Of those 12 apostles, 10 of them had been appointed by Jesus himself. Their authority was on a very certain foundation. If Jesus appoints you, nobody can question that you have authority. He had appointed 12 apostles. One of the apostles, of course, was Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him and went out and committed suicide. And the other 11 apostles had chosen a successor by lot. They had cast lots, and it went to Matthias, and he was enrolled in the 12. And then they lost another of the original apostles, and that was James, the brother of John, one of the sons of Zebedee, and he was killed by King Herod very early on. And so the New Testament doesn't describe how they selected a successor, but at some point between when James was killed and when Paul wrote the letter to the Galatians, a new apostle had been chosen, and that was James, the half-brother of Jesus, who would later write the letter named after him. Now, these were the circle of 12, and they were the acknowledged authorities in the church, but there were also other apostles. Fringe apostles, secondary level apostles, and Paul was one of those. And I think that's where Paul's opponents begin to compromise Paul's authority in the eyes of the Galatians. So we're going to have to continue this when we get, in the next video, we'll get into chapter 1, verse 1. And see what it says. Meanwhile, I hope this has been interesting, and I hope to see you in the next video.